Hello, everyone, and welcome to our talk tonight with Dr. Karin Öberg. I'm just waiting a moment as people all trickle in. But we're so happy to have you this evening, and we're really thrilled to have her here as our inaugural guest for our spring slate of lectures. Just watching the attendees number expand like the universe itself in the first moments after the Big Bang as expansionary forces propelled it. I'll leave the science primarily to Dr. Öberg here.
Nice, though. that was a nice transition. I am very impressed.
Thank you. All right, we're very happy to have you all here tonight. I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Leah Sargent. I'm one of the staff members here at the Aquinas Institute. And we have our chaplain, Father Zach, here on our stream. And just a little reminder about who we are and what we do, especially if you're visiting an Aquinas Institute event for the first time. You can always find our full slate of programs, our mass times, our prayer opportunities at princetoncatholic.org. But a few things I want to let you know about, especially this week, is that this Wednesday, of course, is the beginning of Lent Ash Wednesday, which means there's still time both to eat an enormous amount of bacon today and tomorrow, and to think about how you want to spend your Lent growing closer to God through prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. Our university mass will be at 12:10 on Wednesday. There will be a number of other masses available at St. Paul's, depending on your schedule, and ashes distributed throughout the day. Because Ash Wednesday is a very popular event because everybody loves penance, I recommend that you show up a little early if possible to that 12:10 Mass. We'll be sharing the space with parishioners at St. Paul. We anticipate it may get a little crowded, so the earlier you come, the easier it is to seat people. As students, you don't have to pre-register for this Mass, but again, showing up early makes it easier to make sure we can find you a seat. And just as we proceed through the semester, remember that we have our university mass at 5 p.m. at St. Paul's. And again, there's a registration system for parishioners for the town for St. Paul's, but students can always turn up. We've reserved space for you. But again, a little easier just makes it a little easier for us to seat you according to social distancing. Now, tomorrow night, Father Zach will be continuing his scripture seminar on the devil, exorcism, and deliverance. You don't need to have come to the first session to come tomorrow night. It was a really beautiful first session last week, and I'm looking forward to continuing to hear Father Zach talk about how we engage in spiritual warfare and how meditating on these things can really reveal the fullness of God's glory and power. My husband, Alexi Sargent, and I will be running the next seminar coming up on Aquinas' schedule, which is going to be a seminar in March on friendship and how our friendships with each other can help us grow in friendship with Christ and vice versa. Our hope is that we'll be able to run some of those sessions outside and in person as well as on Zoom. So stay tuned for this later this week when we'll send out a survey about possible times and about people's comfort with meeting in person. And tonight is the first of our 3 lectures for the semester. So please take a look at princetoncatholic.org to learn more about our other guests coming up, which include J.D. Flynn, a Catholic journalist, talking about how to be faithful to the truth and to the church at the same time, especially when covering touchy matters within the church. And Dr. Jeffrey Morrow, a scripture scholar who's going to talk a bit about his own experience as a convert and finding the case for Christ's resurrection. But tonight, I'm thrilled to kick off our semester of lectures with Dr. Karin Öberg, who's a professor of astronomy at Harvard University. She studied chemistry at Caltech and astronomy at Leiden University, and her specialty fuses the two in astrochemistry. And in her research, she looks at how chemical processes affect the outcomes of planet formation, which has incredible relevance to us all as the beneficiaries of the formation of one planet in particular. Her research in astrochemistry has been recognized with a number of awards, including a Sloan Fellowship, a Packard Fellowship, and the Siemens Fellowship. And just what's a particular pleasure for me, she's an active participant in science and religious conversations. She lectures for the Thomistic Institute, the Word on Fire Institute, and the McGrath Institute on Church Life, all of which I think are marked by a real delight in what God has given us, a confidence that our interest in his creation is an invitation to know and love him better, and a real willingness to invite other people into those studies and the fruit of them. She serves on the board of the Society of Catholic Scientists. Tonight, she joins us to talk a little about her own journey into the church and her experience having her science inform her faith and vice versa. So, Dr. Karin Öberg, thank you so much for joining us. And I'll just remind everyone that we'll be taking questions throughout her talk using the Q&A functionality at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. So you can submit questions there. And after her talk, I'll be promoting folks to panelists so you can ask her in person, as it were. Karin, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Leah, and thank you to the whole Aquinas Institute for having me. It's almost as delightful to be here via Zoom as it would be to be there in person, but I do hope I can stop by sometime in the coming years and see you all face to face as well. So just this little roadmap where I want to do in the coming half an hour or so, and I want to try to time myself because I actually find the Q&A the most fun part, which, the unpredictability of that part of the encounter, is that I do want to tell a little bit of my own story and how becoming a scientist and becoming a Catholic, how those two sort of intertwined. And then I do want to switch over to somewhat more universal subject about how we can think about science and religion, and the Catholic religion in particular, and where they might be at odds with one another and where they might help one another. And as you might imagine, I'm gonna place more of a stress on the latter than the former, but I'll try to go through a few common objections and at least sketch out a bit of an answer. But then if there's something, I would say, since I'm only going to be talking for half an hour total, I am going to touch pretty lightly on quite a few things. So definitely feel free to, dig deeper in the Q&A if there's something that particularly touches your heart, whether in my story or these more theoretical concepts that I want to chat to you about. So I said becoming a scientist, becoming Catholic. So that sort of implies that I was born neither. So I was raised in a fairly secular family, culturally Christian, but not spiritually Christian, which would be a very typical family in Sweden, which is where I'm from. In particular, we were, say, non-spiritually but culturally Lutheran Christians, so a very particular form of non-Christian Christian. So in some sense, I have nothing of my current faith that goes back to my early life, except that when I started thinking a bit more deeply about it, there are actually quite a few things. The most important of them being that in Sweden, you still get baptized. So the sacrament that brings you into the church, I had as a baby. And if it's something that I have learned since I joined the church, it's not to dismiss the reality of the blessings that flow from the sacraments, as long as you at least slightly cooperate with them. The other thing is that though my family was secular and is still secular, they said in many ways were culturally Christian. And that meant that the kind of books that I read from very early on are the ones that I later realized were deeply Christian. So we're talking, the typical ones, the Narnia books, but most of all, Lord of the Rings, which was my first literal love affair and has persisted through the years. I'm actually rereading it right now because after 3 years of marriage, we decided to finally get it. My husband and I decided to finally get the TV. I guess we gave in to sort of the quarantine life and decided to buy a TV. And of course, the movie we wanted to watch on it was Lord of the Rings. And then, of course, you have to reread the book first. So I think there were many things in my childhood that actually shaped us, or like molded a certain longing for something greater than what the materialistic worldview can offer. And I started noticing some of that as a teenager, in that there was just some things of a purely that falls from a purely materialistic worldview that I could never accept. And the two most important one being that of morals and free will. So I was never tempted to be a moral relativist. And I do credit my parents as well as the literal upbringing that they gave me for. There was this, even when I would probably have called myself an agnostic, I was completely convinced that there are some things that are good and there are some things that are bad. And it doesn't matter what I think about them. Like it's not a claim on my subjective evaluation of the word, but it is a reality in the word that there are things that are morally good and morally evil. And I guess, slight side note, I find this to be actually one of the most fruitful starting points when talking to non-believers in a university setting, especially today, where I think there is a certain moral sensitivity that is very much alive. I would say sometimes it might go a little bit left field, but there is a sensitivity there that is very much on the move. And this idea that there are really things that are good and bad, I find to be a very, very fruitful entry into talking about spiritual things. That's, I guess, a tip on the side. So when I was a teenager, in Sweden, I didn't like my hometown very much. It's actually a lovely town, I've realized since, but as a teenager, it was not a great fit. And I was good at science, especially at chemistry. And when you are good at science in Sweden, you typically become an engineer, at least as a first step, even if you do sort of the pure sciences later in your career. And the distance that I was thinking about putting between myself and my hometown was roughly that of the Atlantic. And that meant that there were two, like, was really first one school that I was going to apply to for engineering, which is MIT, so down the street from where I am currently. But then my ever so helpful father suggested that there was another school that there was no way I was going to be admitted to, which was Caltech in California. So then I spent the next 2 or 3 years of my high school life trying to do everything I could to get admitted to these two schools. MIT rejected me, but luckily Caltech did not. So I ended up in the US for college. I remained, and I should say that pretty soon after starting college, I realized that in the US, if you do engineering, you actually do engineering. It's not just a way to get to do science. So I switched into doing pure chemistry pretty soon. And there I had my first sort of professional vocational crisis, which some of the students listening might be able to relate to. You might be going through something similar right now, which was the following: that I knew I was better at chemistry than any other scientific discipline, and probably actually than any other academic discipline. But I was not that interested in the questions presented by chemistry. I did think that astronomy had some really cool questions. I thought physics had really cool questions. I thought history had really cool questions. Unfortunately, none of things that I were super good at. And then during my sophomore year, I had a conversation with a professor at Caltech about a potential research project. And he presented one in what was called astrochemistry, that is the application of chemical methods to astronomy. And once I found out that there is a field where I can actually use what I'm good at and that I find meaningful, I've never looked back. So I've never actually had a second sort of professional vocational crisis, which is, I think, in part lack of reflection, that I just, once I committed to it, and this will come back very shortly in how I approach my faith as well. Once I committed to it and no sort of evidence going in the opposite side has been thrown at me, I'm pretty happy to just continue along, and have been a happy astrochemist ever since. The other thing that happened at Caltech, which was important, was that I got to know Christians. I did not have a conversion experience at Caltech, but for the first time in my life, I had friends who were Christian. And I guess another lesson, another side note is, I know, looking back, that there were seeds being sown there that came to fruit much later. I don't think none of them knows. I don't think they knew at the time. I don't think they know now. That you might not know what seeds you're sowing among friends and other students just by them knowing that you are Catholic or are Christian, and just placing those little seeds of doubt in that it is the natural thing to be an agnostic, which I think is what most people assume. They just don't question that is this sort of the natural outlook on the word. So I started to know some Christians. I was starting to develop some. We started putting some of these questions back sort of in front of my eyes. What does it mean that I believe that there are moral absolutes? What does it mean that I intensely experience that I can will things, and I don't want to dismiss that or explain that away as something that's being done to me? And I came to some sort of intermediate explanation of some sort of philosopher's God that seemed adequate at the time. So some sort of deism, I guess, would be the best explanation. But one of the things I started to do, and to this day, I'm not entirely sure why, was I started wearing this little golden cross as a necklace that I had gotten from my great aunt when I was a child. And I think at the time, if I were to try to sort of self-analyze, it was as a statement not for Christianity, but against materialism. And those were pretty much the two sides that were being presented at the time. But it had as a result that a friend of mine assumed that I was Christian, which was, easy mistake to make. And ended up giving me, right as I was graduating, the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. Now, for those of you who haven't read it, this is actually my favorite Lenten reading to do. It's just the most delightful examination of conscience that I know of. I don't know. I feel that there are many things. C.S. Lewis obviously was an academic himself, and I think there are many of the traps that he sort of experienced, at least I experienced as well, in terms of going too much, falling off either to the left or the right of sort of the straight path. And I thought it was a great book, I enjoyed it. So next I bought another book by C.S. Lewis, The Abolition of Man, which was important in that it sort of crystallized what my issues were with a purely materialistic worldview. So I'd already had some ideas about it, but of course, C.S. Lewis much more eloquently described what was going on in my head than I think I could ever have done. And then I made if I wanted to remain an agnostic, the mistake of buying Mere Christianity. So I ordered that off Amazon. It arrived. I took a Sunday, started reading it. And about 1 hour into Mere Christianity, I had gone from being a pretty convinced, well, I guess, doubting agnostic to a convicted Christian. So I had a very quick conversion experience. I said it happened over an hour. I have never had any serious doubts since around midway through Mere Christianity, from an intellectual point of view, at least. And I didn't know really any Christians. The ones I had known in college were more sort of acquaintances than friends. I had no idea how to pray, but I didn't know you're supposed to go to church as a Christian. So I Googled churches. I was then in the Netherlands, in Leiden, had just started grad school. I Googled English-speaking churches. The one that looked the least suspect was the Anglican Church in The Hague, just one town away. And for the rest of my graduate school experience, I went to this Anglican church in The Hague every Sunday and really enjoyed it. Never really got to know any other Christians very much, but it became part of my weekly routine, and I started to settle into that and feel comfortable in that routine. About a year later, one of my brothers thought, I guess my family at that point were realizing that this was not going to go away. And one of my brothers thought that if I was going to do this whole Christianity thing, I may as well do it right. And he gave me Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton to read. That was another unsettling experience. I would say, first of all, being converted in an hour was an unsettling experience. It was mainly an intellectual one. But it was quite emotionally strange to go from one worldview to another within the span of a few hours. Reading Orthodoxy was not like that. It was a much more softer, unsettling experience. It was not a change of worldview like reading Mere Christianity had been. It was more of a feeling of knowing what kind of Christian I was after all. So C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity describes it that mere Christianity is sort of the hallway, and then you have to find the door that you belong in. And reading Orthodoxy, I realized that probably at some point I would become Catholic. Now, I didn't for a few years, and I would say for a couple of reasons. One was that I was happy with the Anglican Church in The Hague. Another was I didn't know any Catholics. And the third was a pretty high cultural barrier, as in Sweden, the Catholic Church is not particularly popular for sort of historical and cultural reasons. So what sort of pushed me over the edge was actually when I returned to the US in 2009, and I started going to the Episcopalian church. And I don't want to insult any Episcopalians listening. They were super nice. And I think they were faithful. But what pushed me into the arms of the Catholic Church was that the Episcopalian church that I went to, they said all the right things. And I mean, they had in some sense their liturgical the liturgies are very similar to what I came to know in the Catholic Church and actually also to the Swedish Lutheran one. But it was like they said everything with a wink. There was like, obviously you not believe all of this, or you don't believe it literally, like, but you still have to say it. I mean, that is what you're supposed to do. And I have this obsession with truth, which has served me well in becoming a scientist, I think. I think it has also served me well in sort of my faith life. Social gatherings, not always as useful to be obsessed about things being absolutely correct. But in this case, I just couldn't stand it. It was really grating on me that this every weekend having this sense of that you're saying something and meaning another thing. So I ended up going down to the Catholic Church, and I had sort of had this in the back of my head for many years that I probably would convert one day, and asked how you do RCIA. And then I spent 2 years in RCIA. Back then it was 2 years, now it's one. If there's any Harvard student listening in, I don't know why it was 2 years when I was doing it. And then in 2012, I was received into full communion with the Catholic Church, still without knowing any Catholics. So my companions were really books at that point. With the one exception that one of my friends from college who had been raised Catholic, left the church for many years, ended up sort of coming back into the church at the same time, which of course forged our friendship for many years to come. After becoming Catholic, I moved to University of Virginia for a year before coming back to Harvard as a faculty in the astronomy department. And I had many good things happening at UVA, but the two most important ones was that for the first time I saw what the Catholic community could look like, especially with young adults. And this is again, I guess, a slight side thing, but if you have grown up Catholic and always have been surrounded by Catholics and know what that community is, you might not realize how much good you do by actually coming to these communities and being there for some new Catholics who have never experienced this before. This was a formative year for me to being, even just like once a week or once every 2 weeks, to actually being surrounded by other Catholics my age who are faithful and in different ways trying to live out their faith also professionally. The other thing that happened was that I connected with the Dominican order that I have been a big fan of ever since. And obviously this is the Aquinas Institute, and I have been very happy to work with and support the Dominican friars ever since. And actually found out that one of my friends from Caltech, a physicist, had also become a Dominican friar. So we reconnected as well. I moved back to Harvard in 2013 and have been a professor of astronomy ever since. And there are a few things that I just want to talk about in terms of what it's like to be a Catholic faculty at Harvard. The first thing that I want to say is that it's been good. I think often we think about that, especially if you're at a secular university, that you're constantly sort of at the battle between the secular part, which is the major part of the university, and the Catholic, trying to be faithful Catholic, living out your faith. My experience has been 99% positive. And I'm only saying not 100% because I'm sure there's been something negative and I'm obsessive about being accurate. But I have had a thoroughly positive experience about trying to live out my faith at Harvard. My atheist colleagues have been really supportive in that I want to spend a lot of time on things like this, talking to students of faith. I serve as a mentor for not just for Catholic students, but also for students of other Christian denominations, and actually then and then of Jewish or Muslim students who I guess can't find anyone better. There aren't that many who are open living out their faith openly at a place like Harvard, which has been a really beautiful experience where I feel that by doing very little, I can actually have a lot of impact on the student's life at Harvard. So it's something to keep in mind, that it doesn't mean it's always going to be easy, and I in no way want to belittle or diminish the real struggles that people have had at a place like Harvard, but it doesn't have to be bad. And I think that you will actually find that most of the time it's going to be good, and that most of the time people are actually going to appreciate the diversity that you bring to the place. That's certainly been my experience, whether it's with students, other faculty, or with the university administration. Among other things, they have encouraged me to teach a freshman seminar on science and religion, which I enjoy doing every other year or so. The thing that I have been trying to think of as I become more conscious about what it means to have a vocation as a Catholic professional or a Catholic academic is thinking about how do you actually live out your faith at the university campus. And the place where it doesn't really matter that much to me is how I do my science in a sort of its strictest sense. I think part of it is because I've always been interested in the kind of scientific questions that have some philosophical connotation as well, like the origins of life, the origins of our planets. I'd be happy to talk if there are questions about it. I could talk about it for a long time. But those things came before I became a Christian. And I think it's more that they both come from the same place in asking some of these bigger questions. But where it does matter is how I think about going about finding those truths. So I'm pretty obsessive about solving puzzles and finding truths about the universe. But where I think my faith provides a really good balance is keeping in mind that it's still more important that the eternal souls that are carrying out this work are doing it well and are growing and being fruitful themselves. So I spend a lot of time thinking about how to have a caring and welcoming environment within my research group, and trying to have that in the department as well. I think mentoring is something that I put a lot of time in. And I think, but maybe most of all, where I find my faith to be very helpful, is it gives you a certain natural detachment to the work you're doing. And if any of you are thinking about an academic career, it's going to be full of disappointments because you're sort of on uncharted territory most of the time, which means that at least half the time you're going to do something that turns out to go nowhere. And it's very easy to sort of, when you pour yourself into your work, to just become really disappointed. And I've just found it so helpful to then go to mass, or that you have this anchor in another word that sort of puts things in a very healthy perspective. And I think that's actually been sometimes made me a better scientist, just being able to remember what matters in the end and what does not. Other things that I have tried to do to sort of be an integrated person is, as I said, is to spend quite a lot of my time on things like this, to think about science and religion, one of the saddest thing that I hear, and this is also from Harvard students, maybe you have had the same kind of thoughts, is that they sort of, if they have a science mind, that they sort of need to turn that off when they're doing their Catholic thing or their faith thing. This should never be the case. You should be a fully integrated person, and you should bring what makes you a good scientist into your relationship with God. And you should bring your relationship to God with you when you're doing science. It's going to make you, at least it's made me, I think, both a more faithful Christian and a better scientist. But that brings me to just sort of a brief survey of some of the objections that people bring up, or why you can actually not be a fully integrated Catholic scientist. And I want to say very, very briefly survey 4 of them, and then feel free to bring up any of them in the Q&A. So one of the things that you hear sometimes is that the scientific method has proven that God does not exist. This, I think, is just a fundamental misconception of what Christians means by God. If you have a God like Zeus, who's sort of an excellent being in the word, you could imagine that there are methods you could deploy to prove that he's not where he's supposed to be. But if we're talking about, a transcendent God that holds all existence in being and is existence in himself, there's going to be no scientific method that you can use to prove or disprove his existence. This is more sort of a philosophical question, which I am not actually a philosopher, but I can point you to some good resources if this does not convince you. Another one is that there are some religions where miracles are optional. Christianity is not one of them. Right at the very core, there is the great miracle of God becoming human, of God rising from the dead, and through that we are saved. So there is this idea that the scientific method has disproven miracles, that you can't have both the scientific method and miracles sort of side by side. This, I think, actually comes to misunderstanding either miracles or the scientific method, one of the two. So just very briefly, the scientific method relies on being able to measure something over and over again, is the easiest way to explain it. Miracles, sort of by their nature, are not something that is predictable. If you try to predict how often humans can walk on water from Jesus walking on water, you'll do a pretty poor job. This is just not what either miracles do or science do. There's a slightly more subtle criticism, which is that miracles are somehow not fitting with an ordered word that's ordered by laws of nature. And here I think you can have an interesting sort of philosophical, theological discussion about what it is that miracles actually do. But one of the things that they do is to reveal, in some sense, what the word is actually like or should actually be like. If you think about miracles of healing, for example, they're actually restoring the word, what it should be like, rather than breaking the human nature, for example. But that I think is a more interesting conversation that one could have. There is a psychological objection, which comes down to that religion relies on faith, science relies on reason, and never the twain shall meet kind of argument. I would say here, if you want, one of the things that scientists do is they look at data and see if the data fits this. If you start to try to name famous scientists, you will quickly find that many of them were not just religious, but much more religious than their time demanded. Newton is a famous example. Kepler, Maxwell are others. Lemaitre, the father of the Big Bang Theory, was a Catholic priest. There is very, very many of these examples. Furthermore, I think if you think about how you pursue science or pursue religion, you'll quickly find that both of them rely on trust, which is maybe sort of the secular form of faith, and both of them rely on the use of reason. If you try to pursue a relationship with God without deploying your reason, it will be a pretty impoverished, I would say, relationship. And similarly, if you try to do science without trusting, for example, the results of your colleagues or the competence of your colleagues, you are not going to get very far. And even more fundamentally, you'll need to do things like trust that reason actually works and that there is an objective reality out there that you can manipulate at will and that other people can also see in a similar way. Final objection is pretty much, well, the previous ones don't matter because historically the Catholic Church has been terrible for science. So who cares about theoretically what could and could not, be compatible? And here I said we can go in deeper on this, but it's complicated. But you should be a bit suspicious, I think, that whenever people bring this up, they typically bring up the same thing, which is the Galileo Affair. And whenever people come up with one example, at least as far as the Catholic Church is involved, of course, evolution and creationism is a more recent one, but it's luckily not one that we in some sense have to be too concerned with, though I'd be happy to talk about it. But people typically bring up Galileo. And they bring up Galileo because that is the clearest example of when things went horribly wrong. But part of the reason they went horribly wrong is that at the center of the Galileo affair, you have two, so how to put this? So my husband is Italian, so I think I can say this without impunity, but two very emotional and slightly self-centered Italian men who used to be friends and then had basically a breakup. And that is part of what made things go so terribly wrong with the Galileo affair. Counterexamples are the university that you're sitting at. The university is a Catholic invention. If you look at where many of the great scientific discoveries came from, people cite religious curiosity as their inspiration. So there are many counterexamples to this. And that leads me to just some final thoughts on, okay, so if it's not an obstacle, could the two be good for one another? I already made the claim that I thought that, you should bring your science with you into your relationship with God and your relationship with God into the science. And I think there are a couple of good reasons to think that this is a correct way of viewing it. One is that if we think about the scientific project, it relies on a couple of assumptions that are, at least from a sort of a modern philosophical point of view, not very well founded at all. One is, and I think that one of the most important thing is that our reason is somehow geared towards truth. If we think if our minds are just a product of evolution, there's no reason that we should trust that they are good at recognizing truths. They should be good at recognizing things that are useful for our survival and procreation. There's no reason that this should be the same as recognizing a mathematical truth, for example. On the other hand, if we believe that we have immortal souls that have been created by God, who is truth himself, to be in the image of him, I think we do have good reasons to trust our reason. Trusting our reason is reasonable. We also know that we're fallen, so we always need to be careful, but that there is that fundamental reason to believe that we can recognize truth when we see it, which is just a foundation of the scientific project. Another big assumption of the scientific project is that the universe is orderly, that it's intelligible. This is also not something that is obvious that it should be true. You could very well imagine a universe that was much less orderly than the one we live in. But it is, again, something that comes very natural out of a Christian understanding of the origins of the universe as the purposeful creation of an intelligent God. And on the other hand, one of the reasons I think that conversion for me was so simple once I read Mere Christianity is that I had gone through 4 years of basically having my mind trained towards recognizing objective truths and then to accept them when presented to me. And this is something that I'm extremely grateful for the scientific education I got at Caltech. And this is speculative, but I wonder if part of the reason that the sciences are currently raised on such a sort of pedestal as the crowning achievement of human thought is that people actually recognize that this is the one discipline where objective truth is recognized and celebrated. And as we do have the kind of souls that are looking for the truths to sort of to cling on, there's actually not unreasonable that right now that sciences are held in such a high esteem, even though I am hoping for a future where the humanities recover, since I do still have this love of history and philosophy and theology. But in the meantime, I think we should be very happy that it seems like everyone recognizes that when a discipline stays faithful to this idea of objective truths, that is something that people are drawn to. And I think I'm going to stop there and make sure we leave plenty of time for questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Oberg. Your story means so much to me since I kind of came into the church through the same two books. And with that same surprise as someone who loved mathematics, that there was even more truth to know. And that not just as a set of theorems, but as a person who loved us, who is truth. I want to remind everyone that I've got some questions that have come in and you can submit them through the Q&A button on the bottom. You can submit them with your name, in which case when I call on you, I'm going to promote you up to be a panelist for a moment so you can ask in person and then bounce you back down to being an attendee so Dr. Oberg can answer. And I am going to start with one anonymous question that was submitted. Because I recently had seen, so I know where this question is coming from, a kind of atheist apologetic, challenging Christians for their silly beliefs, looking at the majesty and the magnitude of the universe and saying, how could you claim that in such a big world, God would die just for humans? And I'd seen especially Dominican priests getting excited to talk about the magnitude of God's love, but in reference to that question, one of our attendees does want to know if you think there is life in other parts of the universe.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I can't help myself but just comment a little bit on the premise as well before answering the question. One of the things that whenever I feel like I'm getting a bit too mechanical in my prayer life or how I'm approaching God, I somehow only have to sort of bring into my mind the immensity of the universe and then think about the sort of ridiculous scandal of the God who is the source of all of that coming into the world as a baby. As it somehow like the fact that we know now that the universe is so enormous and so old, so ancient, I think makes the incarnation like even more poignant, at least to me, rather than because that is a good question by your atheist friend. Like it seems like this is ridiculous. How could he create this whole universe and then die for this like small race of people on this small planet in one galaxy? So first of all, I think it's a great question, and I think there's a lot of things one could like interesting discussions one could have based on it. Do I believe there's life in the universe? So this is it depends on what you mean with life. Any life, yes. I do think that the origin of life here on Earth was a natural process. I do think there's been, while we don't know how it happened yet, I do think there's been some good progress in figuring out some of the possible steps that led to it through sort of different chemical processes. And there seems like there are many environments that are similar enough from what we currently understand about the origins of life here on Earth, that they should have been able to have their own origins of life. So if we're thinking about, let's say, bacteria, do I think there are sort of ET bacteria? I do. And I do hope that at some point we will find them. Now, the second question is, I think, also scientific, and that's sort of scientific one. We don't know the answer yet, but there's a possibility that we will find out if that is true or not. The second question is a combined sort of astronomical and biological one, which is how often, if you do have some sort of life, how often does that sort of single cell life become something like an intelligent ape? So like our animal ancestors. And here we actually don't know the answer to that. And part of the reason is that we only have one example, the Earth. And it's difficult to know from the one example how often the process happens. But what we can say is that it doesn't seem like it's super simple or something you can take for granted. Here on Earth, we spent about 3 billion years as bacteria, and then only 500 million years in something more complex. So it's not obvious that you're going to make that jump just because you have life. But my guess is that y'all probably do it sort of often enough that there should be some more places out there where you have what we're called intelligent animals. Now, beyond that, I think it's a theological question, which is how often do God gift intelligent animals immortal souls? It seems like here on Earth, that he only did it to one kind of intelligent animal. It might be there's something that he would do quite often. It might be something that was a one-time thing, and that in some sense the whole cosmos was created for us, which is a strange sort of thought, but I don't think it's not a theologically impossible one. And if you do posit other rational animals, not just intelligent, you do get into some interesting questions about how the incarnation of Jesus Christ and of Nazareth could be saving those alien races, or if you would need a separate incarnation, and what would that mean for how we understand our own salvation, and what the incarnation actually is, how universal it is. And so there's a whole set of interesting questions there. So I would say yes to material, probably to intelligent, and I'm a complete agnostic on the rational one.
I do like how this question really forces us to reckon with what does make humans distinct, both biologically and theologically. Our next question is coming from Evan, who is rising up. There we go.
Hello. Yes, I guess the Q&A just disappeared. So what was my question?
You typed a question about mentoring students of faith as a Christian.
That's right. Yeah. Since I'm a fifth-year grad student, I do math, and as I'm finishing up my Ph.D., I'm starting to look at postdocs applying both to places like Harvard and places like Notre Dame that at least still have a concentration of Catholic students. So I'm just kind of looking at how you find those opportunities and what I should look forward to.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And I can say even as a faculty, I'm kind of asking myself some of those questions. So I go out to Notre Dame every year for a week, and I love it. You're sort of immersed in this Catholic culture. And so the assumption is that you're a Catholic. I mean, it doesn't mean that everyone is, but the mass times are listed in the elevator in the hotel. I mean, it's just, to me, it's just a beautiful, beautiful experience. And I'm not going to say I'm not tempted by that kind of lifestyle. But on the other hand, as I was saying, at a secular place like Harvard, because there are not so many of us, you can do so much good with so little effort, which is really rewarding and meaningful. And I think there's something similar when you're at the postdoc stage. You're going to have to work harder to keep your faith alive at the secular place. It's going to be more on your shoulders, which can actually be very tiring. I mean, I think that's, if I were to say, going to Notre Dame is restful for me, because for a week, sort of, I don't have to wear Catholicism on my shoulders. It's sort of carrying me instead. But on the other, so you're going to have more sort of potential mentors and Catholic friends at a place like Notre Dame. But on the other hand, you might be able to play a bigger role for graduate students and undergrads if you go to a place like Harvard. Now, there's nothing wrong with realizing our own weakness, and maybe we are at a place in life where we actually need that fellowship and need that, like, other people to mentor us. There's somebody told me that I think this is a common thing, that so Jesus, dined with the prostitutes and tax dealers, so should we. And the response was, I think you're missing who you are in the story. And this is like, I mean, like sometimes we just need to immerse ourselves and be sort of fed by others. And sometimes we're at a place where we can really, feed other people. And I think prayerfully thinking about where you are in your spiritual life is really important for you in the long term to have the biggest impact on the academy. So that's one thought. You can probably just sort of like do more good for others in the secular place on average, but you can be fed more and build up your own faith and community more if you go to a place like Notre Dame. Now, one of the things that's happened in the past few years that's been really good, I think, is that I think really wonderful Catholic student centers have popped up at a lot of secular universities. I mean, I'm very fond of the Thomistic Institute, which I'm working with, but I think they're not the only one. Focus missionaries and the like. I think it's actually not that hard at many secular institutes to find that fellowship. It is still harder to find mentors because there just aren't that many senior Catholics around. So I don't know. Those are just my thoughts. That keep both in mind, both where you can sort of be fed and where you can give, and then pray about it.
I'm going to toss in a question of my own for a moment. Do you have any prayer practices specifically around your work, as you approach your work to kind of consecrate it to God or to remind yourself of his presence as you're working?
In theory, yes. In practice, I'm terrible at it. But I do, I guess, have an advertisement to make, which I discovered the Hallow app because I was like desperate. And I must say, for people like me who are very bad at taking the time to be silent with God. So I used to pray the office a lot. And I actually, for a couple of years, that was something that really helped me in structuring the day because it's every few hours, it's that reminder. Somehow after I got married, that didn't work anymore. And it became much more mechanical when I was doing it. For me, that was so a change of season. And I found that where I needed to spend more time was in silence with God. But I'm terrible at that. I get distracted so easily. So I actually find these sort of guided meditations that only sort of pushes you to be silent with God for a few minutes at a time to be really helpful. So I try to do that at the beginning of each day to sort of set the framework for the rest of the day. And when I do have a hard conversation coming up, or I notice a student that's struggling, I do try to remember to do a very quick prayer beforehand. And one of the ways that I try to that helps me to remember that is to have some Catholic symbols on the wall, also in my office. I have it pretty discreetly, it's I don't want people to feel uncomfortable, but it's there, and that serves as a reminder for me when I look in that direction that, okay, I should really take this 30 seconds and ask for the Holy Spirit to help. And just empirically, it works really well. Like conversations, especially with students, sort of hard conversations with colleagues, they go so much better if you don't do it alone, but allow God to help you. So in theory, I do it a lot. In practice, I'm trying.
I have one other question now, more on the science side, specifically from one of our attendees who wants to know what you think of the fine-tuning arguments for God's existence, especially given the nature of what you study. And perhaps just for everyone here, if you can give a little description of what those are.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So the fine-tuning argument goes something like this, that if we look at the laws of nature, they in themselves don't govern what some of the fundamental constants are that sets the overall shape of our universe. So there are a number of constants, things like the charge of an electron. It's actually a ratio of that, but think about things like the charge of an electron. There's no law in nature that says what that should be. But yet there are sort of 10-ish of these constants that if they were, let's say 10, 20% different, our universe would not exist in a way that would allow for living things to be in it. So there are three sort of possible explanations of this, which are not mutually exclusive. One is that there is some more fundamental law of physics that we have not yet discovered that actually determines what these constants sort of have to be. So it's sort of deterministic. One is the multiverse hypothesis, which is that we live in one of billions of universes, and we just happen to be in the one that got it right. Like the constants took on all different values in all the different universes, and we just got lucky. The third one is that this is a purposefully created universe to, have life originate and then sustained. Now, these three could all be true, which I guess is an important part. But as sort of a proof of God's existence, I don't think it's very compelling, but it's something that is directing our thoughts towards the intelligibility of the universe and of what it's, the orderliness and what the laws of nature are, what they can do, what they can't do, and who our creator is. I find it to be something that's beautiful to contemplate and sort of an icon of just how well God has taken care of us in this universe. Stephen Barr has written on this in ways that I think are helpful.
And we have a related question from Dee, so I'm going to promote her up. Also about kind of the origins of God's work in the world.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. It's been such a joy to listen to this. Based on what you were saying before, it would be amazing to hear a little bit about the origins of the universe and the origins of life, and particularly how what we know scientifically about this relates to what our faith teaches about that, and vice versa.
Thank you. It's a great question, a big question. So I'll be a bit superficial in my answer, but feel free to sort of continue to push me if it's not deep enough. So what science teaches, starting with the origins of the universe. So the Big Bang Theory is the current framework that we think about the origins of the universe within. As I mentioned, it was actually the brainchild of a Belgian priest in the 1930s, and it took quite some time for the scientific world to accept it, mainly because of some of their materialistic atheist views of the word, and therefore commitment to an eternal universe. That's a separate kind of fun story, sort of Galileo Affair in reverse. But what the Big Bang Theory says that you had a very dense, incredibly dense early universe where the whole visible universe could fit into a fraction of an atom. And then that started to expand through several stages. But it doesn't start at nothing. It starts as something that is that's there. This is incredibly dense. Now, some physicists have wanted to push this further and said that maybe this incredibly dense initial state sort of popped into existence in a quantum field and therefore came out of nothing. That is a misunderstanding of nothing, which is why I think all scientists should be forced to study a little bit of philosophy. So a quantum field is something, even if it is a pretty, vague something compared to the universe that we are typically associated with. So there's nothing. So when we think about sort of explanatory models or frameworks, the Big Bang Theory explaining how the very young universe developed into become something we can recognize of the universe today is in no way in conflict with the idea that God created the whole universe out of nothing as an act of love. So those two, I would say, are very nicely compatible in explaining the universe we live in and why it is the way it is. Origins of life and the sort of evolution of life is another one that I think nicely shows the compatibility, even if it's not, I guess, as extreme of a case as the origins of the universe. So origins of life, as I briefly mentioned, we don't know exactly how it happened. The idea is that through a series of steps, organic chemistry can sort of self-organize to form something that we would recognize as a living cell. Some of those steps have actually been shown to sort of work, which is, here's, I guess, sort of like semi-philosophical, but that suggests that there's something built into chemistry, laws of chemistry, that's actually pushing you towards an interesting form of complexity under a certain situations, which in itself, I think, is an interesting sort of law of nature that we happen to be in the universe where that happens. So this is the hypothesis, but it's a scientific hypothesis that people are currently working on solving. Then on the other hand, we have God, who is the author of the laws of nature that allow for this to happen. And I think that's how I would put the two next to one another, that you have on the one hand, you have this sort of laws of chemistry that seems to be working itself out towards forming life under some conditions. And then you have the author of those laws. And I think you can do, you didn't ask about sort of evolution, but I think you can do something, you can think about it in sort of a similar way, that we seem to be living in a universe where when you have life, under some circumstances at least, that evolves in a direction that results in the development, of a large brain, for example, that allows for the physicality of forming mental images, for example, which we think about as something that's needed for a rational mind to operate and take in information. And the word for rational, I shouldn't say rational mind. If you're an angel, you don't need it. But the rational animal needs something like that to sort of take in information. And I actually find Genesis description of this have always been very touching to me, how God sort of out of the earth shapes the human body and then breathes his spirit into us. So I think that is actually very compatible with how we think about our history, which is that up until a couple of 100,000 years ago at most, we don't know exactly where the first theological humans appeared. Somewhere between probably 200,000 and 50,000 years. If we think about when people start making sort of beautiful paintings on the wall, they're probably theological human at that point. That we have this sort of slow development with the human animal coming into being out of the soil, and then when it's sort of ready to take in the kind of information that it needs from the rest of the world to process it with a rational soul, it is ensouled by God. So that's my very, I guess, brief take on it.
Thank you so much. I really love your gloss on Genesis there, and just how much the natural world is not in competition with God, but is part of what he uses to show his love for us. We've been so thrilled to have you here tonight, and I'd like us to just close with a prayer from Father Zach.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been such a blessing to hear your reflections and to hear how God is working in your life. So let us pray. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the gift of creation. St. Paul tells us that ever since the creation of the world, your invisible nature has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. We thank you most especially for having been created in your image and likeness, with the ability to reason and do scientific investigation of the world around us. Help us to grow in our sense of wonder as we contemplate the mysteries of creation and the gift of our redemption. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God in our redemption. Help us to grow in faith so that all of our studies and work and all that we do will give you glory. Bless us as we go forward in our studies, in our search for truth, and especially bless our speaker this evening. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all so much for joining us, and I hope you all uncover elements of God's glory in creation around you at whatever scale and in whichever discipline you study. Good night, everyone.
And thank you for all the fun questions. I really enjoyed this.